In the world of finance, the most powerful forces don't explode overnight, they build quietly, layer by layer, until one day the very engine of growth becomes the source of collapse. China's economic rise was once the defining story of modern capitalism, a model so efficient that the rest of the world could only watch in awe. But today that same model is showing deep fractures. This is not just a story about a country, it's a story about what happens when an entire system pushes itself beyond its own limits. And to understand how we got here, we have to rewind to the beginning of a transformation unlike anything in human history. When prices drop so low that winning becomes the only goal, eventually nobody wins at all. For years, China's economic ascent appeared invincible, a nation turning production efficiency into a kind of brutal poetry. Cities that hummed through the night, factories illuminated like constellations, and costs sinking predictably year after year until Western rivals simply surrendered the race. It was the triumph of scale, discipline, and long-term design, a civilization converting human labor into industrial horsepower. But every miracle carries a shadow. And China's greatest strength, its unmatched ability to churn out goods cheaper, faster, and on a scale no one else could touch, has grown into the force dragging it downward. Nothing in economics is ever as straightforward as it looks. China's rise became the ultimate stress test of global capitalism. A system that prizes expansion above everything, even when that expansion erodes the very foundation it stands on. So what happens when the world's manufacturing giant pushes efficiency to the point of self-harm? When optimization becomes a slow-moving collapse. To understand that, we must revisit the dawn of China's economic awakening. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping stood before the Communist Party and shattered one of socialism's sacred assumptions. He declared that prosperity wasn't a betrayal of ideology, it was a duty. With that one shift, he ignited an economic revolution the world had never seen before. Almost overnight, farmers became small business owners. Rural landscapes transformed into factory networks. Investment capital poured in, first from Japan, then from the United States, then from Europe, each one seeing the same irresistible equation: cheap labor, abundant manpower, and a state eager to make business work. China rolled out a handful of special economic zones, experimental cities where the usual rules didn't apply. No heavy-handed planning, no suffocating bureaucracy, no ideological checkpoints. Just one objective: attract money and boost exports. The experiment succeeded too well. Shenzhen, once a quiet fishing village of barely 30,000 residents, exploded into a megacity of millions. Within 20 years, the formula replicated across the nation. Every province wanted a boom. Every mayor wanted the next Shenzhen. Local governments borrowed aggressively, pouring money into highways, power grids, logistics hubs, anything that might lure another factory. By the early 2000s, China wasn't just expanding. It was consuming the world's appetite for raw goods. Steel, coal, oil, copper, the world's supply chains bent to China's demand. Western companies that wished to survive outsourced production there. If something could be made, sooner or later China would make it. But beneath this unstoppable rise was a dangerous incentive structure. Success depended on being cheaper than everyone else. Local governments competed by slashing land costs, cutting taxes, lowering wages. Companies battled by shrinking margins, trimming quality, and sacrificing profit for volume. Everyone chased growth. Almost no one chased sustainability. It was progress disguised as a race to the bottom. And for a time it worked anyway. Millions of workers poured in from the countryside each year, ready to work grueling shifts for a fraction of Western salaries. Factories never stopped. Ports never rested. Western consumers enjoyed the miracle: the $5 t-shirt, the $300 iPhone, the illusion of endless abundance without inflation. And China grew wealthy. But somewhere between the 10th shopping mall and the 100th steel plant, the engine overheated. Growth became dependency. Local governments relied on non-stop expansion to service the debts they took on to build even more factories. So they built even more. By 2015, China's steel production capacity exceeded that of the entire rest of the world combined. Whole industrial belts churned out goods faster than global markets could possibly absorb. Prices weren't falling because of breakthroughs, they were falling because of panic. Factories didn't slow when profits disappeared. They revved harder, betting that higher output could bury the losses. It couldn't. And that's when a new term emerged, borrowed from sociology but now applied to an entire economic structure: involution. Involution isn't just people working harder for diminishing rewards. It's companies producing more for diminishing returns. Competition shifts from innovation to bare survival. What once described exhausted students now described entire industries. Solar panels, EVs, batteries, the shining icons of China's new economy, turned into battlegrounds of involution. Dozens of companies, many funded by the state, flooded markets with nearly identical products. Everyone cut prices. Margins vanished. But no firm dared scale back. In a system where output equates to political legitimacy, halting production means losing face. So the spiral tightened. Firms slash prices to protect market share. Rivals respond. Profits crater. Wages stagnate. Consumers cheer briefly, unaware that cheap abundance eventually erodes the prosperity that created it. China has entered an age of industrial involution, a loop where efficiency consumes profit and production devours purpose. It's no longer a race to innovate, it's a sprint toward the bottom. And in every race to the bottom, victory is impossible. This is why Chinese solar panels often sell below cost. Why electric vehicles sit unsold in vast lots. Why tech giants fight for a shrinking domestic consumer base as valuations slide. And why, despite record exports, industrial profits plunged over 20% in 2024. When everyone competes to be the cheapest, the only thing that can still fall is price. That isn't capitalism in high gear. It's capitalism cannibalizing itself. And here's the twist, China has lived through this before. In the 2000s, when steel and coal overproduction pushed prices into the basement, Beijing stepped in to forcibly cut capacity, shutting mines, merging factories, laying off hundreds of thousands. It was economic surgery, painful but necessary. 2 decades later, the pattern returns, but now the patient isn't one sector. It's the entire growth model. Factories don't close when spreadsheets say they should. They close when politics allows it. And in China, politics rewards momentum, even when that momentum is circular. Behind closed doors, officials see the numbers: sinking profits, stagnant wages, rising debt. But publicly, the message never changes. Keep producing, keep expanding, keep believing. Because if the machine stops, the illusion collapses. By the 2020s, China's once unstoppable efficiency engine had morphed into something far stranger, an economy locked in a relentless contest against its own shadow. From afar, it still looked like triumph. Record exports, gleaming megafactories, a river of electric cars and solar panels capable of lighting nations. But inside the machine, margins were evaporating. The miracle wasn't generating new wealth anymore. It was stretching the same dollar thinner and faster each passing year. Economists have a term for this: overcapacity. But in China, overcapacity isn't a malfunction, it's a feature engineered into the system. Take solar panels. In 2023 alone, China manufactured more than double the world's total demand. Prices plunged almost 40% in a single year. Companies sold below cost just to clear inventory. Dozens of smaller firms disappeared. Yet the giants kept operating because local officials needed the jobs, the tax revenue, and the illusion of unstoppable momentum. Electric vehicles tell the same story. Over 100 Chinese EV brands are battling for a domestic market that isn't expanding fast enough to support them. Each survival strategy begins with a price cut. Competitors respond. The government steps in with subsidies to avoid mass layoffs. But subsidies only extend the cycle. More output, lower prices, thinner margins. The consequences are written in the numbers. In the first half of 2024, China's industrial profits fell by over 20%, despite strong export volumes. Factories are shipping more goods than ever while earning less from every single unit. The economy is still growing, yes, but the quality of that growth is quietly deteriorating. Here's the twist: not all of this is accidental. A large portion is deliberate. For years, Beijing has perfected the strategy of weaponized efficiency, supporting key industries long enough for them to suffocate global rivals. It isn't a game of quarterly returns, it's a long bet for dominance. In sectors like EVs, batteries, and solar, China is willing to sacrifice short-term profits to secure future control. Local governments pour billions into new factories, easy credit, tax breaks. Companies press forward even when selling below cost. The goal isn't survival, the goal is elimination. Flood the market, underprice everyone, and wait. Private Western firms, constrained by shareholders and short-term profitability, simply can't keep pace. Many fold. And once supply chains everywhere rely on Chinese production, China gains the leverage all monopolies crave, the power to dictate terms. This playbook isn't new. China used it on steel, rare earths, and shipbuilding. But this time, the battlefield isn't old industrial commodities. It's the infrastructure of the future. Lithium batteries, photovoltaic technology, electric drivetrains, the arteries of tomorrow's economy. On paper it's brilliant. In reality it's brittle. No empire can burn money forever, even strategically, without the structure underneath beginning to decay. When entire sectors grow dependent on government lifelines, efficiency becomes addiction. Companies stop competing based on innovation. They compete for subsidies. Productivity becomes political. And the line between national strategy and national liability starts to blur. That is the hidden danger behind China's price war economy. These aren't just market battles, they are fiscal landmines. Every yuan spent propping up unprofitable factories is borrowed from tomorrow's stability. And that's what makes this version of the China trap so tragic. The strategy that once propelled China to dominance is now eroding the foundations of its own economy. Because conquest built on losses doesn't lead to victory, it merely postpones collapse. It isn't the fall in demand that brings down an empire. It's the collapse of purpose. And purpose has been replaced with inertia, a system forced to keep running because it doesn't know how to stop. Local governments need factories working to service their debts. State-owned banks need those factories to keep borrowing. And the central government needs all of them active to maintain the appearance of full employment. If one piece slows, the rest frays. So the machine does what it always does. It accelerates. More output is mistaken for more prosperity, even when the numbers prove otherwise. This is the political logic of state capitalism. Production equals control. When growth weakens, the state doesn't retreat, it doubles down. When prices sink, it cuts them further. When the private sector hesitates, local officials provide more credit. Every imbalance is met with a larger version of the same imbalance. It's not madness, it's survival. Because China's economy isn't only an engine of wealth, it's the backbone of political legitimacy. The social contract has one clause: keep growing and the public will keep believing. That formula worked when growth lifted incomes. It falters when growth merely produces cheaper goods. The paradox is brutal. China's industrial surplus keeps global inflation low, yet suppresses its own wages and domestic spending. The nation that once lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty now struggles to elevate the people it already saved. And the more China exports deflation, the more fragile the world economy becomes. In the West, cheap Chinese goods once felt like a blessing, keeping inflation tame, filling shelves, enabling middle-class comfort. But that same abundance is now exporting stagnation. Western factories can't compete. Developing nations can't build their own industries. The global cost of cheap is now global stagnation. China didn't invent this trap. History did. Britain's coal empire once buried global prices so low that its own miners couldn't survive. Japan in the 1980s hit the same wall. Excess capacity, deflation, and aging population that stopped spending. Ancient Rome collapsed not from foreign invasion but from overproduction, vast slave estates growing so much grain that prices fell and small farmers, the heart of the republic, were destroyed. Every empire that perfects efficiency eventually reaches this crossroads. Can it slow down before it destroys itself? China's leaders know this. That's why they speak endlessly about rebalancing, shifting from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth. But rebalancing requires patience, and patience is the one resource a hyper-optimized system lacks. While Beijing tries steering the national ship toward innovation and consumer strength, provincial governments remain trapped in their old incentives. They keep building factories, pushing output, expanding infrastructure because that's how their careers and their budgets survive. It's like trying to diet while the kitchen keeps cooking. The true irony? Many of China's most overproduced goods, solar panels, EVs, batteries, are exactly what the world desperately needs for the clean energy transition. But when prices collapse and companies go under, even the green revolution stalls. The world gets cheaper technology. China gets shrinking profitability. Cheap abundance becomes a trap. Not because it fails to create wealth, but because it removes the motivation to create more. When that happens, efficiency stops being a strength. It becomes a pathology. China's issue isn't too little productivity, it's too much. It's a powerhouse that has mastered production but lost balance. A nation that can saturate the world with goods, yet cannot generate enough demand at home to justify them. There's a cruel symmetry in that. The same relentless competition that made China rich now prevents anyone within the system from staying rich. This is the fate of an economy where growth becomes identity, where production replaces purpose, where progress is measured not by value but by how cheaply you can make something the world already has too much of. That isn't development. It's evolution without direction. And like every empire before it, China is discovering the final truth. Nothing costs more than becoming too cheap. Because when a system optimizes everything except balance, eventually the only thing left to erode is itself.